Montana Territory, July 1881. The church bells were ringing when her father tore the contract in half, one clean rip, sharp as the sound of her heart breaking. Brielle Morgan stood frozen under the white clapboard archway of St. Agnes Church, the hem of her pale blue dress brushing the dusty steps, her hands trembling around a bouquet of wildflowers. The townspeople stared. They had all come to see her marry Thomas Greeley, a kind enough man with a soft voice and steady hands, but he was not who her father wanted. "Over my dead body," Judge Elias Morgan growled, throwing the torn pieces of the marriage contract onto the ground like they were garbage. "You will not marry a man with no land and no name." Thomas looked like he wanted to speak, but her father's deputies were already moving toward him. He lowered his eyes and stepped away. Brielle did not cry. She had learned not to cry young when her mother's coffin was lowered into the cold earth behind that same church, when her father started calling his whiskey glass his only companion. She just looked at the torn paper, then at the man she had nearly married, and nodded once. "Go home, Thomas." He did. She dropped the bouquet on the ground and turned, walking away from the church without a single word to the people who had come to see her wed. No one followed. Not even her father. 2 hours later, she was barefoot in the grass behind the barn, the only place on their land where she could breathe. The sky was wide and blue above her, and everything inside her felt empty. The sound of hooves broke the quiet. She stood up fast, brushing her hands on her dress. A lone rider was cutting across the field toward the trees fast, like he was running from something. He was dressed in black with dust on his coat and a rifle tied to his saddle. Whoever he was not from town. She took a step forward without thinking. The rider spotted her and pulled the reins hard. The horse reared, kicking up dirt before settling. "Do not scream," he said, voice low and even. "I was not going to," Brielle replied. He frowned, clearly not expecting that. He looked over his shoulder. "Is that man with the badge still Judge Morgan?" "Yes, thought so." He looked back at her. "You his daughter?" "I was not sure anymore." He nodded once like that made sense. "Name's Elias O'Connell." She crossed her arms. "You are an outlaw." "I am, and you are running from something." "Also true." They stared at each other for a second. "I am not turning you in," she said finally. "I did not think you would." His voice softened just a little. "You looked like someone who knows what it is to run." Brielle's throat tightened. "What did you do?" He looked away. "Something I had to." Before she could ask more, shouting came from the far side of the field. Elias looked toward it, then back at her. "I need to hide. There is a root cellar behind the smokehouse. No one checks there." He hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you," she pointed. "Go, I will cover the door with feed sacks." He turned his horse and galloped toward the smokehouse. She walked quickly to the barn, grabbed 2 burlap sacks filled with oats, and dragged them out just in time to see him disappear beneath the cellar door. She dropped the sacks over it, dirt and straw flying. When the sheriff and 2 deputies rode up minutes later, she was brushing her dress off like she had been there all afternoon. "You see anyone ride past here?" the sheriff asked. "I have been here since noon," she said. No one came by. They looked around, but no one questioned her. That night, after the sun went down and the house was quiet, Brielle slipped outside with a blanket and a crust of bread she had saved from dinner. She moved the sacks and opened the cellar door. Elias was sitting on the ground, coat off, a lantern burning low beside him. "I brought you food," she said, climbing down. He took it, eyes steady on her. "You did not have to." "I wanted to." He nodded and ate in silence. She sat beside him, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. After a while, he said, "What happened today?" "My father tore up my marriage contract." "Why?" "He wanted me to marry a banker from Helena. I would rather die." Elias looked at her, something warm in his gaze. "You deserve better than that." "I do not even know what I deserve anymore." They sat in silence again, then she asked, "What did you really do?" He looked down at his hands. "There was a man beating his wife and son. No one in town would stop him. I did. He died. Now I am wanted." Brielle's chest ached, not from fear, from knowing. I would have done the same, she said. He looked at her like she was the first person who had said that. She stood. I will bring you breakfast in the morning. Before she left, he touched her hand lightly. Thank you, Brielle. She paused at the cellar door. You remembered my name. I will not forget it. Over the next week, she kept him hidden. Every night she brought him food. Every morning they talked, sometimes about nothing, sometimes about everything. She told him about her mother, about the days when the house was full of music and light. He told her about the brother he lost in the war, the life he tried to build in Idaho before it all fell apart. He smiled more now. So did she. One night, as a thunderstorm rolled in, she found herself curled beside him in the cellar, the blanket shared between them. Rain hammered against the wooden door above. He whispered, "You make me feel like I am not lost." She looked up at him. "You are not." His hand brushed her cheek. "You are the first light I have seen in a long time." She leaned in before she could stop herself. Their kiss was quiet, but it changed everything. When they pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. "I have nothing to offer you, Brie. You already offered me more than anyone else ever has," she whispered. "You see me." He exhaled slow, hand still against her cheek. "Then let me say it plain, I would marry you right now if I could." Tears stung her eyes. "Then do." He stared at her. "I do not care about papers or law. My father destroyed that. But if you vow yourself to me, truly, I will vow myself to you." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a silver ring, worn but still whole. "It was my mother's," he said. "I have carried it every day." He took her hand. "I, Elias O'Connell, vow my life to you, Brielle Morgan. No matter where we go, you are my home." She swallowed hard. "I, Brielle Morgan, vow myself to you, Elias O'Connell. Whatever comes, you are where I belong." He slid the ring onto her finger. And just like that, in the dark, damp cellar beneath her father's land, she was married to an outlaw by choice, by love, by truth. And he had given her something no paper ever could. The cellar air had turned warm by morning, the storm's weight still pressing against the land like a held breath. Brielle rose first, brushing straw from her skirt. The ring on her finger caught what little light slipped through the cracks in the wooden hatch. Elias was still asleep beside her, one arm tucked beneath his head, the other resting near hers, not touching but close enough that her skin remembered it. She stepped over him carefully and climbed out, replacing the sacks in their place once the door was shut. The barn cats were already stalking between the feed barrels, and the hens in the coop were scratching at the damp earth with renewed fuss. She gathered a basket of eggs, salted pork from the smokehouse, and a heel of bread, then made her way quietly into the house. In the kitchen, her father's mug still sat half-filled on the table. He hadn't come home last night. She didn't look for him. By the time she returned to the cellar, Elias was sitting up, coat on, hair damp from the storm's humidity. "You slept through thunder," she said, passing him the basket. "I learned to sleep through cannon fire," he replied, cracking an egg into the small pan she had brought the day before. "The rest's just noise." She sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. "How long until the law gives up? They'll search the range for another day, maybe two. Then they'll figure I kept riding north. You didn't." "I know." She glanced at the pan, then back to his face. "You could still go." "I could," he said, flipping the egg, "but I'm not." Brielle inhaled slowly. "Then we need to build something that can hold." He looked at her carefully. "What are you thinking?" "There's an old trapper's cabin 4 miles west. Papa used it when he hunted elk in the winter. It's half collapsed now, but the chimney's sound. If we fix the roof and bring in supplies, no one would think to check it. You'd leave the house." "I already left it when I helped you hide." His brow furrowed. "You're sure?" "I'm sure of you." They didn't speak for a minute. "What do you need from town?" he asked. "Rope, nails, tin for patching. There's coin hidden in the lining of my mother's sewing chest." He nodded once. "I'll go tonight after dark. You'll meet me at the ravine near the cottonwoods?" "Yes." He reached into his coat and pulled out a strip of leather. "Take this for your hair. You shouldn't walk at night with it loose." She let him tie it gently, his hands steady, fingers grazing her neck only briefly. When he was done, she touched the knot. "I never thought I'd feel safe with someone again." I never thought I'd be allowed to stay still, he said. Later, when dusk fell and the bats began to dart above the barn rafters, Brielle packed what she could into a flour sack: 2 blankets, a flint, dried beans, and her mother's psalter. She wore boots instead of slippers and wrapped her shawl tight against the wind that had started to rise. She passed through the orchard behind the house without being seen. The trees there hadn't borne fruit in years, but she still knew every path between them. At the ravine, Elias was already waiting with a mule and 2 oilskin bundles tied to its back. "You found what we need?" she asked. "Enough to mend a roof and start a fire." She took the reins, walking beside him as they moved westward. The moon was thin but bright enough to see the worn trail. Coyotes called far off but didn't come close. When they reached the cabin, it was worse than she remembered. One wall had caved inward and half the roof sagged under the weight of years. Still, the stone hearth stood solid and the floorboards were dry. Elias set about clearing the debris, working by lantern light. Brielle swept dirt and dead leaves from the corners, then opened one of the bundles to reveal a small iron cookpot and 2 tin cups. He watched her. "You thought of everything." "I've been planning my escape since I was 15, she said softly. "I just didn't know where I'd go." He didn't answer, only crossed the room and pressed his forehead to hers again like he had in the cellar. But this time, his hands came to rest on her waist and hers settled over his heart. "We'll fix this place," he said. "We'll make it ours." She leaned into the quiet of his promise. "And no one will tear it from us." By the time the first stars faded into dawn, the wind had died, and the cabin smelled of smoke and bread. They sat before the fire on 2 overturned crates, sharing coffee boiled from grounds he'd bartered for with a coin she'd once hidden beneath a false bottom drawer. Elias reached for her hand. "When I was a boy, I thought freedom meant riding with no one to answer to. And now," his thumb brushed the back of her hand, "now it means waking up beside someone who doesn't flinch at what I've done." "I don't flinch," she said. "And I won't start now." Outside, the forest stirred with morning light. Inside, they began to build. The first frost came early that year. Brielle stood outside the cabin at dawn, her shawl pulled tight across her shoulders. The sky above the pines was brushed in soft gray, and the grass beneath her boots was crisp with ice. She watched the breath rise from the mule's nostrils as Elias led it down to the creek, its hooves muffled on the frozen earth. Inside, the fire was still low, a curl of smoke slipping from the chimney. She had started a pot of beans before sunrise, letting them soak while she boiled water for washing. The cabin belonged to them now, not in name or deed, but in sweat and silence, and the way it held their voices without echo. When Elias returned, he hung his coat by the door and knelt beside the hearth, rubbing his hands to chase off the cold. "You're up early," he said, glancing toward the pot. "I dreamt of glass breaking," she replied. He didn't ask what it meant. Instead, he reached behind the crate they used as a table and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Found this wedged behind the chimney stones," he said, unwrapping it. "Looks like someone left it behind years ago." She stepped closer. Inside the cloth were 3 carved wooden dominoes, their dots faded but still clear. "Trapper must have passed the time here," she said, touching one lightly. "Funny what people leave when they think they won't come back." Elias turned one over in his hand. "Maybe they plan to return and just..." "Couldn't," she didn't answer. The beans began to simmer and she stirred them slowly, the scent beginning to fill the room. "I need to go into town," he said after a moment. Brielle looked over her shoulder. "What for?" "There's a man there named Henry Talbot. Used to run with a freight outfit out of Butte. He owes me a favor from years back, might have a line on papers, something that makes us harder to track." She let the spoon rest in the pot. "You'll be careful." "I won't linger more than a day." "I'll wear a different coat, different name." She folded her arms. "And if someone recognizes you, I'll be gone before they can speak it aloud." She stepped closer, her voice quiet. "You don't have to prove anything." "I know," he said and touched her hand, calloused fingers warm against hers. "But it's not just about hiding anymore, it's about staying." He left after midday, taking only the mule and a bundle of salted meat. She watched from the edge of the trees until he disappeared beyond the rise. Then she turned back to the cabin, the quiet settling heavier than before. She spent the afternoon mending the hem of her brown skirt with thread she'd found tucked inside one of the cabin rafters. The wind picked up, fluttering the tarp they had nailed over the back wall where the boards had rotted through. She would patch that next once he returned. Together. That night, she lit the lantern early and read aloud from her mother's psalter, though the words felt colder than they used to. She slept with the rifle beside the bedroll, not out of fear but readiness. He didn't return the next day, nor the one after. By the fourth morning, she saddled the mule and rode east, not toward town, but to the old woman who lived beyond the low ridge, 3 valleys over. They called her Widow Fletcher, though no one remembered her husband's name. The widow was boiling apples when Brielle arrived. "I need someone who listens more than she speaks," Brielle said without preamble. Widow Fletcher wiped her hands on her apron. "Then you've come to the right place." They sat in the orchard behind the widow's house, knees touching under a shared quilt. "I married a man without papers," Brielle said, "but I knew what I was doing." The widow poured cider into tin cups. "Love doesn't wait for ink and signatures. He left 3 days ago to protect the life we're building. I told myself I wouldn't worry until the 6th day. And now, it's the 4th, and my hands won't stay still." Widow Fletcher sipped her cider. "You could go after him. If I ride into town asking questions, I'll raise more than dust." There was a long pause. "I know a boy," the widow said at last. "Rides for the postmaster, but he's sharp. I'll send him quiet, see what he hears." Brielle exhaled slowly. "Thank you." By dusk the next day, the boy returned with a folded slip of paper. No name, just a single line written in Elias's steady hand, "Safe. 2 days more. Stay warm." She held the paper to her chest until the lantern flickered out. When Elias rode back into the clearing on the 6th morning, the sun was just cresting the ridge. His coat was torn at the sleeve, and he carried a new saddlebag slung across his back. She stepped out of the cabin and met him halfway. "You're late," she said, though her voice betrayed no anger. There was a mudslide near the old mining road, lost a full day rerouting. Her arms went around his neck before he'd even dismounted. He held her there, breathing her in like he'd crossed a desert. "Did you find what you needed?" she asked. He pulled a folded envelope from his coat. "2 names, neither mine, one for travel, one for land." She stepped back to look at him. "Land? There's a homestead claim 2 valleys north. Widow with no heirs past last winter. Her neighbors willing to sell the deed cheap if he thinks we're just another couple looking to settle quiet. You want to buy land? I want us to be seen as more than shadows." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "And if someone questions it, they won't," he said, "because we'll be the ones planting fence posts and raising hens. Let them see what they want." She took his hand and placed it over her heart. "Then let's go north." They left the cabin behind that same afternoon, the wind chasing their tracks until the forest swallowed them whole. And ahead beyond the ridge, past the frostbitten trees, waited a place where no vows could be torn and no father could reach. The land was higher ground, tucked between 2 sloping ridges where the wind moved slow and the soil kept the warmth of sun longer than the valleys below. They reached it by foot, Elias leading the mule while Brielle carried the ledger paper folded twice and tucked inside her coat, the one bearing the name she'd chosen to claim, the name not born of her father's temper or her mother's grave, but one she'd written herself beside Elias's. The neighbor, a man with a weathered face and a fence line riddled with gaps, met them at the edge of a half-burnt sugar maple. He didn't ask questions, only counted the coins Elias laid out in small stacks on a flat stone. Then he handed over the key to the cabin, rusted and cold. "It's not much," the man said, nodding toward the field, "but the well's clear and there's a root cellar that don't leak." Brielle didn't look at the house first. She looked at the hill behind it, the way it bowed gently toward the western slope, where cottonwoods grew in a loose ring around a spring-fed stream. She could imagine hens there, and maybe a row of beans planted in early spring. Elias touched her back lightly. Let's see the rest. The cabin was one room with a loft tucked beneath the eaves. Dust covered the floor and a bird's nest lay crumbled in the hearth. There were no chairs, but the table was sound and the shutters latched tight against the wind. Brielle opened one and let the light in. "We'll need a stove," she said, "and a second blanket before winter deepens." "I'll ride to the trading post come morning," Elias said. "There's a man there who deals in salvage. I'll find what we need." She ran her fingers along the window frame. "We'll need nails to fix the porch and oil to keep the lamp burning through the dark months." "I'll get those, too." When he stepped behind her, she leaned back without thinking, her spine fitting into the curve of his chest, his arms circling her waist. She rested there a moment, watching the wind stir the yellowed grasses beyond the fence. "You think this place will hold us?" she asked. "I think we'll build it strong enough to keep anything else out." They spent the rest of the day sweeping, clearing out what the mice had left behind. Elias patched the shutters with strips of bark, and Brielle set a kettle to boil over a fire built carefully from the dry pine found beneath the old shed. They didn't speak much, but the silence felt easy now, like a worn quilt pulled over familiar shoulders. That evening they sat on the porch together, legs stretched out, her head resting against his shoulder. The stars were sharper here, closer somehow, like they had drawn nearer to listen. "Did you leave anyone behind?" she asked, her voice nearly lost to the wind. He didn't answer at first. "There was a woman once," he said finally. "Before the war, we were young. I left for the cavalry thinking I'd come back a hero. She married someone else while I was still marching." Brielle turned her face into his coat. "I'm not going anywhere. I know." She traced the seam of his sleeve with one finger. "I used to think love meant safety. And now I think it means knowing where your hands belong when the world goes quiet." His breath caught. "I never thought I'd be worth someone's beginning," he said. "You are mine," she said. They rose before sunrise the next day. Elias saddled the mule and left with a list in his pocket, careful to take the long road west where fewer riders passed. Brielle stayed behind, pulling water from the well and scrubbing the boards near the hearth with lye and ash. By evening, she had cleared enough space to roll out the spare quilt and hang her mother's psalter on a nail beside the window. She didn't read it anymore, but the pages carried the scent of the house she grew up in. And that was enough. When Elias returned 2 days later, he carried a stove grate wrapped in burlap and a lantern half full of oil. He had found a cast iron pan, 2 chipped plates, and a second blanket with a stitched border faded nearly white. She met him at the gate, hands still dusted with flour from the biscuits rising near the fire. "You found more than I expected," she said, taking the lantern from him. "I bartered with an old man who'd sooner trade than count copper. Gave him the leather satchel I carried through Missouri, said he'd never seen stitching that fine. You made that satchel. It got us here." "That's enough." That night, after the fire had burned low and the last crumbs had been cleared from the plate they passed between them, Brielle climbed into the loft first. Elias followed, ducking beneath the low beam, his shoulders brushing both walls. She drew the blanket up and left a space for him beside her. He settled in close, their legs tangled, the heat between them quiet and steady. "Do you ever miss the road?" she asked. "I miss the sky at night," he said. "But not the part where no one waits for you come morning." She closed her eyes, her hand resting over his. "I'll be here," she whispered. "I know." The wind moved outside, but the cabin held. And for the first time since the morning she'd stood alone in her wedding dress, Brielle slept without dreaming of broken things. The shingles Elias had nailed over the porch roof held steady through the first snow. It came overnight, a light dusting that softened the hard edges of the land and glazed the bare branches in silence. Brielle stepped out that morning wrapped in her wool shawl, the one she'd refashioned from an old horse blanket, her boots pressing clean prints into the untouched white. The mule huffed near the woodshed, steam rising from its nostrils as it pawed the earth. Inside, Elias was sharpening the drawknife on the edge of a worn strop, one knee braced against the table leg. The cabin smelled faintly of pine pitch and the boiled turnips Brielle had cooked the night before. He looked up when she stepped back in, snow still clinging to her sleeves. "Creek's not frozen yet," she said, unfastening the clasp at her collar. "But the edges are starting to crust." Elias wiped the blade carefully. "We'll need to cut more kindling today. The stack won't last through next week. There's a stand of cedar just west of the ridge. If we use the sled, we can bring a full load back." He nodded and set the knife down. "I'll hitch the mule. You chop, I'll haul." They worked silent and steady, the way they had learned to do in these colder weeks. The wind was sharper now, but the trees gave cover and the rhythm of labor kept their hands from stiffening. Brielle's axe bit clean through the smaller trunks, and Elias bundled the split logs with rope, stacking them on the sled until it groaned under the weight. At midday, she sat on a felled trunk and bit into a strip of dried venison he passed her, chewing slowly. "You ever think about what you'd be doing now if none of this had happened?" she asked, her breath catching in the cold. He didn't answer right away. "I think I'd be looking for a way out of something. Always felt like I had to keep moving. And now I just want to stay still long enough to see what spring looks like with you beside me." She looked at him for a long moment, her fingers tightening around the meat. "I used to think peace was something other people earned. I didn't think I was meant for it." "You were," he said, his voice low. "You just had to find someone who knew how to keep it with you." They returned to the cabin with the sled full and their coats soaked through. By nightfall, the new wood crackled in the hearth, and Brielle had sewn a patch over the thinning spot in Elias's sleeve with thread she'd bartered for from the widow 3 valleys over. He watched her work, his eyes following the needle's path. "You sew like someone who learned early," he said. "I did," she replied, not looking up. "Mama had me fixing socks by the time I could count to 20. Do you ever miss her less?" "No," she said quietly, "but the missing settles. It stops scraping you raw." He reached across the table and gently closed his hand around her wrist, stilling the needle. "You've carried a lot. So have you." He turned her hand over, his thumb brushing the inside of her palm. "You think we've earned what we have now?" "I think we built it," she said. "And we're still building." That night she reached for him first, curling against him beneath both blankets, her cheek pressed to the hollow of his throat. He kissed the top of her head, his breath warming her skin. "I want you to have more than this," he said. "I don't," she answered without hesitation. "I want this exactly." His arms tightened around her and they lay still, listening to the slow hush of snow falling on the roof. By late winter, Elias had traded 6 smoked trout for a goat and a tin pail. Brielle started rising before dawn to milk it, her hands red from the cold but steady. She made cheese by the fire, wrapped in linen and pressed beneath a stone. In the evenings, she read aloud from the single worn volume of poetry they'd found tucked in the loft rafters, her voice soft and low. They kept to themselves, but word of them traveled. Folks from the outer homesteads began to nod when they passed, some offering eggs for firewood, others just watching with quiet curiosity as the couple walked side by side through the snow-packed trail to the trading post. No one asked where they came from. No one needed to. Elias built a second chair come March, shaping the legs with a borrowed spokeshave and carving a small pine flower into the backrest. Brielle didn't ask him to. "I thought maybe," he said, placing it beside the hearth, "you'd want a place to sit when your hands are tired." She touched the carving carefully. "You remembered the flowers that grew behind the orchard." "I remember everything," he said. That spring, she planted beans and squash in rows behind the cabin. He dug fence posts while she laid seed, and by the time the rains came, their land was lined with green shoots, and the hum of bees drawn to the wild clover that had returned to the hill. One evening, as she stood at the edge of the field with soil on her boots and the smell of new growth thick in the air, Elias came up behind her and slipped a folded scrap of paper into her hand. "What's this?" she asked, unfolding it. He looked down, his voice quiet. It's the claim. I filed it under the names we chose. She stared at the ink, her throat tightening. It's official, it's ours. She turned to him, tears burning behind her eyes. We did it. He brushed her cheek with the back of his fingers. You did it. You made it home. She leaned into him, her hands resting over his chest. No, we made it together. They kissed then, slow and certain, the way people do when there is nothing left to fear. That night, they sat beneath the stars on the porch Elias had rebuilt by hand, their shoulders touching, fingers laced together. The lantern flickered beside them, casting gold light on the worn boards and the field beyond. The sound of frogs rose from the creek and the air smelled of pine and turned earth. I thought I'd live and die alone, Elias said. You didn't, Brielle whispered. He turned to her, his voice rough. Thank you for finding me, she kissed his hand. Thank you for staying. They didn't need to say anything else. Years later, their cabin still stood, stronger with each season. Children from nearby homesteads came for lessons in letters and numbers, seated on stools Elias had carved. Brielle taught with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her voice calm and sure. Elias spent his time mending saddles and trapping small game for trade, his rifle rarely needed now. Every Sunday, they walked together to Widow Fletcher's orchard, bringing cheese and bread in a worn basket. The widow, now near blind, always smiled when she heard their steps. You stayed, she said once, her voice brittle with age. We did, Brielle said, her hand resting lightly on Elias's arm, and they had, through cold and hunger, through stillness and storm, they had stayed. Not because they had no other choice, but because they had chosen each other. Again and again, and in the valley where no one came looking anymore, beneath the same sky that once watched them run, they built a life no one could take, and they were never alone again.